Which was the first TV network?
It was the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, founded November 11, 1926, by David Sarnoff. 1891 to 1971, who was then President of Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Sarnoff, considered one of the pioneers of radio and television broadcasting. Created NBC to provide a program service to stimulate the sale of radios. In the 1940s he reorganized the network to provide TV programming. Again to stimulate sales of RCA products, this time, televisions. It was Sarnoff who demonstrated television at the World's Fair in New York in 1939. Next came Columbia Broadcasting System. CBS, on September 26, 1928, which was established by William S. Paley, 1901 to 1990, an advertising manager for Congress Cigar Company. Paley sold some of his stock in the cigar company in order to raise $275,000 to buy into the beleaguered United Independent Broadcasters, which controlled Columbia Phonograph, hence the name. He built the floundering radio network into a powerful and profitable broadcasting organization. The American Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, television network was last. In 1943. It was only by government order that the third network, ABC, was created at all. In 1943, when RCA was ordered to give up one of its two radio networks, it surrendered the weaker of the two, NBC Blue, which was bought by Edward J. Noble, the father of Lifesavers candy. In 1945 Noble formally changed the name to the American Broadcasting Company, which 3 years later began broadcasting television from its New York flagship station.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase "according to Hoyle."
Is Stravinsky the 20th century's foremost composer?
The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky, 1882 to 1971, is certainly one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Stravinsky wrote concerts, chamber music, piano pieces, and operas, as well as ballets, for which he may be most well known. Between 1903 and 1906 Stravinsky studied under the great Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844 to 1908. In 1908 Stravinsky wrote his first work of note, the orchestral fantasy Fireworks, which was in honor of the marriage of Rimsky-Korsakov's daughter. The piece caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, 1872–1929, of the Ballets Russes, who invited the young composer to participate in the ballet company's 1910 season. Ballets Russes had dazzled audiences the year before, bringing new energy to the art form. In collaboration with Diaghilev, Stravinsky went on to create masterpieces The Firebird, 1910, Petrushka, 1911, and Rite of Spring, 1913, among them. The partnership served to elevate the role of the ballet composer in the art world. Rite of Spring is either Stravinsky's most famous or most infamous work. It was first performed by the Ballets Russes in the third week of its 1913 season. The choreography was arranged by the famous dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, 1890–1950. But the performance stunned both the music and dance worlds. So extreme was the audience's reaction to this premiere work that a riot nearly broke out inside the theater. Stravinsky had composed his music not to express spring's idyllic qualities but rather its turmoil and dissonance similar to childbirth. Nijinsky paired Stravinsky's composition with complicated and visually frenzied dance movements, later characterized by the composer as a jumping competition. Though many thought it a disastrous performance, when the Ballets Russes continued to London, Rite of Spring was more widely accepted there largely because the audience had been duly prepared for it. The following year, Rite of Spring was performed in concert in Russia, but the reaction was mixed. The young composer Sergei Prokofiev, 1891–1953, was in the audience and later wrote that he had been so moved by the work that he could not recover from the effects. Listeners today are still moved by the elevated rhythm of Rite of Spring, which makes an entire orchestra into a kind of sustained percussion instrument. Ultimately, most musicians and critics came to regard the watershed work as one of the finest compositions of the 20th century.
How old is golf?
Some historians trace golf back to a Roman game called Paganica, when they occupied Great Britain between roughly AD 43 until 410. Romans played the game in the streets, using a stick and a leather ball. But there are other possible predecessors as well, including an English game, called Kambuka, a Dutch game, Kalf, a French and Belgian game called Chol, and a French game, Jeu de Mail. But the game as we know it, the rules, equipment, and 18-hole course certainly developed in Scotland, where it was played as early as the early 1400s. The rules of the game were also codified there. The Rules of Golf was published in 1754 by the St. Andrews Golfers, later called the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. The first golf club, formed 1744, was the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers in Edinburgh, Scotland. And it was none other than Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1587. Who is credited with being both the first woman golfer and the originator of the term caddie? The term is derived from the French term for the royal pages, cadets, who carried the Queen's clubs.
How did cable TV develop?
The industry had its beginnings in the 1970s, when home box office HBO started to beam its signal to customers on a subscription basis. It was a radical concept: let audiences pay direct for the programming, in this case, movies, rather than having it wholly supported through advertising and, in some cases, syndication fees. Another development during that decade proved to have lasting effect: Southern businessman Ted Turner. 1938, bought an independent TV station based in Atlanta and dubbed it a superstation. WTBS was soon made available to some 10 million subscribing households and was the beginning of Turner's cable TV empire, which would later include cable news network, CNN, CNN's headline news, Turner Network Television, TNT, and, briefly, the music network VH1. Soon there were a number of niche-based cable networks airing programming around the clock: music television, MTV, was reaching teens and 20-somethings, Lifetime targeted women, ESPN focused on sports, black entertainment television, BET, catered to the African American audience, and American movie classics, AMC, appealed to a cross-section of American viewers who share a fondness for old, mostly black and white, movies. By the 1980s, the three major television networks, which had risen to power in the 1950s and had remained on the top of their game for the next 2 decades, found that their audience share was dropping. This was aided by the introduction of the upstart Fox television network, backed by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, 1931. Fox's programming, geared toward a young, hip, and increasingly multicultural audience, found its own following. Soon Americans had more choices than ever before, and for a relatively low subscription cost. By the 1990s, the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, were reaching only 61% of the television audience. Not to be beaten at their own game, the networks responded to the new competition by producing more cutting-edge shows, programs that likely would not have made it on the air before the advent of cable. Further, they began charging their affiliate stations for programming, a trend begun by CBS in 1992.
How old are card games?
Card games are believed to have originated in China in about a.D. 800. By the late 1200s, cards had made their way to Italy, perhaps carried aboard merchant ships, and from there spread to other parts of Europe. The present-day variety of 4 suits, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades was adopted in France during the 1500s.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
Who was Balanchine?
The name of the Russian-born choreographer is synonymous with modern American ballet. George Balanchine, 1904 to 1983, was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century, creating more than 200 ballets in his lifetime and choreographing 19 Broadway musicals as well as 4 Hollywood films. He co-founded 3 of the country's foremost dance institutions: the School of American Ballet, in 1934, the American Ballet Company, 1935, and the New York City Ballet, 1948, the first American ballet company to become a public institution. His entrance into the world of dance was entirely accidental. In August 1914, Balanchine accompanied his sister to an audition at the Imperial School of Ballet and was invited to audition as well. Though his sister failed, he passed and, against his own wishes, was promptly enrolled. However, Balanchine remained uninterested in the art form, even running away from school shortly after starting. The turning point for the young dancer came with a performance of Tchaikovsky's ballet The Sleeping Beauty, 1890. He was dazzled by the experience and chose to stay with the school's rigorous training program. Serenade, 1935, music by Tchaikovsky, is considered by many to be Balanchine's signature work. His other well-known works include Apollo, 1928, The Prodigal Son, 1929, The Nutcracker, 1954, and Don Quixote, 1965, as well as Jewels, the first full-length ballet without a plot. Remembering the opportunity he had been given as a child, Balanchine was known for choreographing children's roles into many of his ballets. His outreach did not end there. He organized lecture demonstration tours for schools, gave free ballet performances for underprivileged children, conducted free annual seminars for dance teachers, and gave free advice and use of his ballets to other ballet companies. Balanchine's unparalleled body of work was instrumental in establishing the vibrant style and content of contemporary ballet in America, where he brought ballet to the forefront of the performing arts.
When did the big band era begin?
On December 1, 1934, Benny Goodman's Let's Dance was broadcast on network radio, which effectively launched the swing era. in which big band music achieved huge popularity. Goodman, 1909 to 1986, was a virtuoso clarinetist and bandleader. His jazz-influenced dance band took the lead in making swing the most popular style of the time.
How old is baseball?
Baseball, America's pastime, is more than 200 years old. According to legend, the sport's originator was U.S. Army officer Abner Doubleday. 1819 to 1893, who was credited with inventing and naming the game in 1839, while he was attending school in Cooperstown, New York, the site of the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. But in 2004 a document was uncovered in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Citing a 1791 bylaw prohibiting the playing of baseball too close to, within 80 yards of, the town's meeting hall. Historians verified the authenticity of the document and its date. This is believed to be the earliest written record of the game, and it establishes that the stick and ball sport was being played 42 years before Doubleday's involvement. Baseball historians have long acknowledged that the sport, which is similar to the English games of cricket and rounders, had not one father, but thousands. Although the 2004 discovery indicates that the game was already in existence in 1791, and popular enough to be the subject of a town ordinance. It was in the 1800s that baseball developed into the game Americans still love today. The first baseball club, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, was organized by American sportsman Alexander Cartwright, 1820 to 1892, in 1842 in New York City. By 1845 the team had developed a set of 20 rules, which included specifications for where the bases are positioned and how runners can be tagged as out. The rules also defined a field of play, outside of which balls are foul. The so-called New York game spread in popularity after a famous 1846 match in Hoboken, New Jersey. By 1860 there were at least 50 organized ball clubs in the country. Union soldiers helped spread the game during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And the popularity of the sport greatly increased during the last 3.5 decades of the 19th century. The first professional baseball team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which began play 1869. In 1876 the National League, NL, was founded. It included teams in Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Ohio, Hartford, Connecticut, Louisville, Kentucky, New York, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, Missouri. By the 1880s the sport had evolved into big business. An 1887 championship series between St. Louis and Detroit drew 51,000 paying spectators. The American League, AL, was formed in 1901, and 2 years later the two leagues staged a championship between their teams. In 1903, the Boston Red Sox beat the Pittsburgh Pirates in the first World Series. An overall increase in American leisure time. Created by the innovation of labor-saving household devices as well as a reduction in the average laborers. Workweek helped baseball become the national sport and its favorite pastime. Played on an open field, the game harkened back to the nation's agrarian roots. But with its standardized rules and reliance on statistics, it looked forward to a modern, industrialized future.
When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent. The most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers. Was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
When was public broadcasting started?
In the United States it was started in 1967, when the Public Broadcasting Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. 1908 to 1973, on November 7. Creating a corporation for public broadcasting to broaden the scope of non-commercial radio and TV beyond its educational role. Within 3 years, and as a result of federal grants, plus funds from foundations, business, and private contributions, Public Broadcasting Service (PBS) rivaled the big three networks NBC, CBS, and ABC, for viewers. In England, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, took control of the development of television in 1932, launching BBC TV. The BBC had been founded as a radio broadcaster in 1922 under the leadership of English engineer John Charles Reith, 1889 to 1971. Reith remained at the helm of the BBC for 16 years after its founding, and under his guidance, it became one of Britain's most revered institutions, supported by the public with license fees.
Who invented jazz?
Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, 1885 to 1941, a New Orleans pianist, claimed credit for having invented jazz. And to some degree, it was fair of him to think so. After all, his recordings with the group the Red Hot Peppers, 1926 to 30, are among the earliest examples of disciplined jazz ensemble work. But in truth, the evolution of jazz from ragtime and blues was something that many musicians in several cities took part in. Most regard Morton as one of the founders of jazz. The other founders include Benny Moten, 1894 to 1935, U.B. Blake, 1883 to 1983, Duke Ellington, 1899 to 1974, and Thomas Fats Waller, 1904 to 1943. Some would go back even farther to trace the roots of jazz. From 1899 to 1914, Scott Joplin, 1868 to 1917, popularized ragtime, which was based on African folk music. Even astute music critics may not be able to draw a clear-cut distinction between ragtime and early jazz. Both musical forms rely on syncopation, the stressing of the weak beats, and either style can be applied to an existing melody and transform it. The definitions and boundaries of the two terms have always been subject to debate, which is further complicated by the fact that some musicians of the time considered ragtime to be more or less a synonym for early jazz. But there are important, albeit not strict, differences between the two genres as well. Rags were composed and written down in the European style of notation, while early jazz was learned by ear. Players would simply show one another how a song went by playing it. Jazz encourages and expects improvisation, whereas ragtime, for the most part, did not. And the basic rhythms are also markedly different, with jazz having a swing or hot rhythm that ragtime does not. Whatever its origins, jazz became part of the musical mainstream by the 1930s and influenced other musical genres as well, including classical. American composer George Gershwin, 1898-1937. Was both a songwriter and composer of rags as well as a composer of symphonic works. Many of his works, including Rhapsody in Blue, 1924, and his piano preludes, contain ragtime and jazz elements. Perhaps more than any other composer and musician, Miles Davis, 1926 to 1991, expanded the genre, through decades of prolific work. Davis constantly pushed the boundaries of what defines jazz and in so doing set standards for other musicians.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
How old is tennis?
The game is believed to have originated in France, where it was called jeu de paume, meaning game of the palm, in the 1100s or 1200s. Players hit a small ball back and forth over a net using the palms of their hands. The father of modern tennis is English soldier and sportsman Walter Clopton Wingfield, known as Major Wingfield, 1833 to 1912, who in 1873 published a rule book for lawn tennis and in 1874 patented equipment for the game.
How old is country music?
Old-time music or hillbilly music, both early names for country music. Emerged in the early decades of the 1900s. By 1920 the first country music radio stations had opened, and healthy record sales in rural areas caused music industry executives to take notice. But it was an event in 1925, in the middle of the American Jazz Age, that put country music on the map. On November 28, WSM Radio broadcast the WSM Barn Dance, which soon became known as the Grand Ole Opry, when the Master of Ceremonies, George D. Hay, took to introducing the program that way, since it was aired immediately after an opera program. The show's first performer was Uncle Jimmy Thompson, 1848 to 1931. Early favorites included Uncle Dave Macon, 1870 to 1952, who played the banjo and sang, and Roy Acuff, 1903 to 1992, who was the Opry's first singing star. Millions tuned in, and soon the Nashville-based show had turned Tennessee's capital city into music city, USA. In the 1960s and again in the late 1980s and 1990s, country music reached the height of popularity. While holding on to its small town, rural-based audience who were the show's first fans.
Why does controversy surround Christopher Columbus?
It is due in part to the fact that history wrongly billed Columbus. 1451 to 1506, as the discoverer of the New World. The native peoples living in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus were the true discoverers of these lands. These peoples had migrated thousands of years before. It is believed that as early as 50,000 BC, they came across the Bering Strait from Asia, and migrated southward, throughout North and South America, reaching Tierra del Fuego by 8000 BC. Therefore, it is correct to say that Columbus was the first European to discover the New World, and there he encountered its native peoples. But it was for his treatment of these native peoples that Columbus is a controversial figure. Columbus was called back from the New World twice, on his second and third voyages, to be investigated for his dealings with the Native Americans, including charges of cruelty. The first inquiry, 1496–97, turned out favorably for the explorer. His case was heard before the Spanish king, and charges were dismissed. However, troublesome rumors continued to follow Columbus, and in 1500 he and two of his brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, were arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though later released and allowed to continue his explorations, he would make one final trip to the New World. Christopher Columbus never regained his former stature, lost all honor, and died in poverty in the Spanish city of Valladolid in 1506.
Why is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales important to literature?
The unfinished work, which was begun about 1486 and written during the last 14 years of its author's life, is considered a masterpiece of Middle English, the language spoken by Anglo-Saxons in England from c. 1200 into the late 1400s. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400, who was the son of a wealthy wine merchant, weaves together stories told by 28 pilgrims whom the storyteller, the poet himself, met at an inn. The pilgrims, along with the innkeeper who joins them and the poet, represent all facets of English social life: aristocracy, clergy, commoners, and even a middle class, which was not officially recognized by the social structure of the day, but which, in fact, existed. To connect the tales, Chaucer uses the framing device of a journey to the shrine of Thomas Becket, c. 1118 to 1170, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who in 1170 was killed by overzealous knights in the service of England's King Henry II. In his prologue, Chaucer indicates that each traveller was to tell two Tales out and two tales back from the reader's ability to comprehend reality. Canterbury Cathedral, for a total of 120 stories, which were intended to entertain the pilgrims during their trip. But Chaucer wrote only 24 tales, 2 of which are incomplete. The tales include bawdy humor, fables, and lessons. While the pilgrims reach the shrine, they do not return, a device some scholars have interpreted as deliberate on the author's part, as it suggests the human journey from earth to heaven. Whatever the intention, the Canterbury Tales reveal the author's ability as a storyteller. As the editors of the Norton Anthology of English Literature assert, rivaling Shakespeare in the art of providing entertainment on the most primitive level, and at the same time, of significantly increasing the tales, were extremely popular in late medieval England. Printed and reprinted numerous times, particularly during the 1400s. Chaucer's rendering of details reveal both story and storyteller, pilgrim, at once, giving the reader a remarkable insight into the characters and revealing basic human paradoxes which transcend time.
Why is the Magna Carta important?
The Magna Carta, arguably the most famous document in British history, has had many interpreters since it was signed by King John, 1167 to 1216, who was under pressure to do so. On June 15, 1215, in the meadow which is called Runnymede, between Windsor and Staines, in Surrey, England, drawn up by English barons who were angered by the king's encroachment on their rights. The charter has been credited with no less than ensuring personal liberty and putting forth the rights of the individual, which include the guarantee of a trial by jury. No freeman shall be arrested and imprisoned, or dispossessed, or outlawed, or banished, or in any way molested, nor will be set forth against him, nor sent against him, unless by the lawful judgment of his peers, and by the law of the land. King John, who ruled from 1199 to 1216 and was also called John Lackland, had a long history of abuse of power, while his brother Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1199, was still king. John tried to wrest the throne from him. Though he failed in his effort, when Richard died in 1199, John did ascend to king, inheriting 4 French duchies, which he soon lost. Upon his refusal to recognize the new Archbishop of Canterbury, John was excommunicated. In order to regain favor with the Pope, he was forced to give up his kingdom, 1213, and receive it back as a papal fief. He was further required to pay an annual tribute to the Pope. It was in raising funds that John ran into trouble with England's powerful barons, who were outraged at and tired of his interference in their affairs. The barons drafted the 63 chapters of the Magna Carta, writing it in the king's voice, and met John along the banks of the Thames River as he returned in 1215 from an unsuccessful invasion of France. The document, to which John was forced to put his seal, asserted the rights of the barons, churchmen, and townspeople, and provided for the king's assurance that he would not encroach on their privileges. In short, the Magna Carta stipulated that the king, too, was subject to the laws of the land. In that the Magna Carta made a provision for a great council, to be comprised of nobles and clergy who would approve the actions of the king vis-a-vis his subjects and ensure the tenets set forth in the charter were upheld. It is credited with laying the foundation for a parliamentary government in England. After signing it, John immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III. 1160 or 1161 to 1216, who issued an annulment of the charter. Nevertheless, John died before he could fight it, and the Magna Carta was later upheld as the basis of English feudal justice. It is still considered by many to be the cornerstone of constitutional government.
What was Thomas Cavendish's claim to fame?
English navigator Thomas Cavendish, c. 1560 to 1592, followed in Sir Francis Drake's 1540 or 1543 to 1596 footsteps. Seeing Drake return from his exploits at sea and against the Spanish, Cavendish was inspired. And it was for good reason. Drake had earned himself fame, wealth, and the honor of being knighted. So in 1586 Cavendish set out with 3 ships for Brazil, made it through the Strait of Magellan, and then proceeded to capture Spanish treasure including their prized ship, the Santa Ana. The kings of Spain later mourned the loss and the fact that the ship had been taken by an English youth, with 40 or 50 companions. Cavendish, now in the Pacific, continued his voyage, which took him to the Philippines, Moluccas, and Java before he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Africa, and returned home. The journey had taken 2 years and 50 days, cost him 2 of his own ships, and made him the 3rd person to circumnavigate the globe. But his welcome in England was not what he expected. Cavendish was received with acclaim, but was not knighted by the Queen. The fame and fortune that had come his way quickly vanished. He spent most of his new money, and his renown soon faded. By 1590 Cavendish thought he would try the journey again. Setting sail with 5 ships in August 1591, the fleet was headed for trouble. Having made it to South America, heavy storms separated the ships as they attempted to make their way through the Strait of Magellan. The ship Cavendish captain turned back toward Brazil, attempting to make landfall. But Cavendish himself never made it. He died en route, believing he had been deserted by his mates.
What was the Pax Romana?
The Pax Romana was the height of the Roman Empire, a period of peace that lasted from 27 B. c. to AD 180, roughly 2 centuries. During this time, no other country or force was strong enough to challenge the Roman Empire, so citizens turned their attention to commerce, learning, the arts, and literature, all of which flourished.
Why do historians draw comparisons among Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great?
All four men were fiercely powerful and seemingly indomitable leaders. And their early lives and careers shared some interesting characteristics as well. First, none of them were native sons of the countries they ended up ruling, and some would say, defining. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, was born in Georgia. German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, in Austria. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in Corsica, which, though technically a new possession of France, was decidedly more Italian in nature. And King of the Macedonians Alexander the Great, 356–323 BC, was from the fringe city-state of Macedonia. Yet it was, respectively, Russian, German, French, and Greek culture that each leader spread. All four men rose to power through the military, or, in Alexander's case, who succeeded his father, after having carried out military strategy. Once installed as rulers, all led fantastic military campaigns to expand their spheres of influence. The wars brought on by their nationalism left millions dead. Finally, all four men inspired, and some would say continue to inspire, terror in the human soul. Still, history has been more forgiving of both Alexander and Napoleon, who today seem to be portrayed as often as heroes as they are as megalomaniacs. With Hitler's and Stalin's horrible legacies a more recent memory. The view of these men is decidedly and far more consistently dark and loathsome.
What happened after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing?
During the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, investigation that followed the February 26, 1993, tragedy, it was learned that the World Trade Center was one of several intended targets of an Islamic extremist group. The bomb explosion in Lower Manhattan killed 6 people and started a fire that sent black smoke through the 110-story Twin Towers, injuring hundreds and forcing 100,000 people to evacuate the premises. Days later, on March 4, 25-year-old Mohammed A. Salameh, an illegal Jordanian immigrant, was arrested in Jersey City, New Jersey. Salameh was later found to be a follower of self-exiled Islamic fundamentalist leader Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, 1933, who was wanted by Egypt for having incited anti-government riots in 1989. In June, Investigators seized Arab terrorists they accused of plotting to blow up several New York City sites, including the United Nations headquarters and the Holland and Lincoln tunnels. U.S. authorities then arrested Rahman and imprisoned him on suspicion of complicity in the World Trade Center bombing. On October 1, 1995, a federal jury found Rahman and 9 other militant Muslims guilty of conspiring to carry out a campaign of terrorist bombings and assassinations aimed at forcing Washington to abandon its support of Israel and Egypt. The 1993 bombing foreshadowed the terrorist strikes of September 11, 2001, which destroyed the landmark Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan and launched what came to be called a global war on terrorism.
Has a tsunami ever hit the United States?
Yes, in fact the tallest tsunami ever recorded hit Alaska in 1964, it was 220 feet high. The March 28 event was brought on by an earthquake, the Great Alaskan Earthquake in Prince William Sound, measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale. The seismic wave, tsunami, hit the southwest part of the state and claimed 107 lives. Hawaii also sees an occasional tsunami, or giant wave, though the most remarkable one hit the islands before they became a state. On April 1, 1946, all of the water drained from the 3-mile-wide harbor at Hilo, which was immediately followed by a tsunami that rushed on shore, destroying the waterfront. The process repeated itself twice and resulted in the death of more than 150 people in Hawaii.
Why is Napoleon still controversial?
Even history has not been able to sort out the widely disparate opinions of the diminutive French ruler. And both the detractors and the champions, or some would say the apologists, continue to publish their arguments and supporting research. The most obvious point on which scholars differ centers on the fact that, first and foremost, Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, was a military man. Here opinion divides quite naturally. Not long after Napoleon assumed power, in the coup of 1799, he proceeded to keep France and the rest of Europe at war for more than 10 years. From the French perspective, Napoleon was a great man, a brilliant strategist who could not only muster his troops but could keep them motivated to fight one campaign after another. The targets of these campaigns: England, Russia, Austria, Germany, Spain, and Portugal among them, view Napoleon in quite a different light, as would be expected. Researchers from these countries have seen and rendered Napoleon's dark side, calling him a megalomaniac and a psychopath, and even seeing him as a forerunner of Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. To further complicate the matter of how history views Napoleon, before he declared himself emperor for life, in 1804, and launched his military conquests throughout the continent and beyond, 1805. Napoleon enjoyed a brief period in which many Europeans, not just the French, believed him to be a hero. After all, he assumed leadership of France after the hideous period of Robespierre's terror and the ineffectual government of the Directory. And then he proceeded to make peace with the Americans, the Russians, and the British. Many believed Napoleon was just the man to bring order to the chaos France had known since the storming of the Bastille. And he extended an olive branch to France's longtime enemies. It looked like he would restore order at home and abroad. Of course, this honeymoon did not last. By 1805, the leader many had looked to end the turmoil only became the cause of more turmoil. His compulsive war-making, as one writer put it, soon swept over the continent, ultimately uniting various countries in an effort to rid Europe of the scourge that was Napoleon and his Grand Army. Thus, students and readers are left to sort through the diverging accounts of this controversial figure. Napoleon has been called the Emperor of Kings, credited for his vision, insight, courage. And even with the development of the modern liberal democracy, he has also been described as a compulsive tyrant who had an insatiable appetite for battle, a man whose own ambitions left millions dead. But on a few descriptions both sides can agree, he was a brave soldier, an inspired military leader, and, at least for a time, a charismatic ruler.
How old is the compass?
The first compass dates back to the 1st century B.C., when the Chinese observed that pieces of lodestone, an iron mineral, always pointed north when they were placed on a surface. There is evidence that Arab sailors were using compasses as early as AD 600, and as Arab influence spread north into Europe, so did the compass. By the 14th century, European ships carried maps that were charted with compass readings to reach different destinations. Portugal's Prince Henry, 1394 to 1460, also called Henry the Navigator, advanced the use of compasses in navigation by encouraging sailors and mapmakers to coordinate their information to make more accurate maps of the seas. Also in the 15th century, an important observation was made by none other than Genoese navigator and explorer from Spain Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506. Who noticed that as he sailed to the New World, his compass did not align directly with the North Star. The difference between magnetic north and true north is called declination. In the 16th and 17th centuries, scientists began to better understand Earth's magnetic fields. American Elmer Sperry, 1860 to 1930, built the first gyro compass, a device that works day or night, anywhere on Earth, even at the poles, where lines of force are too close together for magnetic devices to function properly. When the gyro compass is pointed north, it holds that position. Before the compass, which simply indicates north by a means of a magnetic needle or needles that pivot. Sailors used the sun, the moon, and the stars to determine direction and navigate their ships.
What were the Crusades?
The Crusades were a series of 9 Christian military expeditions that took place during the end of the 11th century and throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. The stated goal of the Crusades was to recover from the Muslims the Holy Land of Palestine, where Jesus Christ, C6b.ca.d30, lived.
How many leaders did the Soviet Union have?
From its formation in 1922, just 5 years after Tsarist Russia had fallen in the Revolution of 1917. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, had only 10 leaders. But just 5 of these had meaningful tenure, either due to length of time served or true authority: Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. After Tsarist Russia ended with the Revolution of 1917, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, 1870 to 1924, became head of the Soviet Russian government as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. The Communists, dissolving the elected assembly and establishing a dictatorship. This lasted 6 years. When Lenin died of a stroke in 1924, Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, who had been an associate of Lenin, promptly eliminated his opposition and in 1929 established himself as a virtual dictator. Stalin ruled the USSR during World War II, 1939 to 45. And though he was aligned with the United States, Britain, and the other Allied nations during that conflict, soon after the war, he began a buildup of power in Eastern Europe, leading to the Cold War, 1947-89. Even though Stalin's domestic policies were extremely repressive and he ruled largely by terror, he remained in power until his death in 1953. After Stalin died, the Soviet Union entered a brief period of struggle among its top leaders. Deputy Premier Georgy Malenkov, 1902 to 1988, a longtime Stalin aide, came to power. In 1955 Malenkov was forced to resign, and he was succeeded by his and Stalin's former defense secretary, Nikolai Bulganin, 1895 to 1975. However, Bulganin was a premier in name only. The true power rested with Communist Party Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, 1894 to 1971, who expelled Bulganin and officially took power as premier in 1958. Khrushchev denounced the oppression of the long Stalin years, which had ended only 5 years earlier, and worked to improve living standards. On the international front, he pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West and even toured the United States in 1959, meeting with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1890 to 1969, In 1960 a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over the USSR, raising doubts among the Soviets about Khrushchev's policy toward the West. Further troubles at home resulted from widespread hunger due to crop failures. Meantime, Khrushchev advanced the cause of Soviet space exploration, beginning the so-called space race with the United States. Eventually, his stance on international issues, which included a rift with Communist China, led to his downfall. He was removed from power in October 1964. Khrushchev's ouster, which was a forced retirement, had been engineered by his former ally and political advisor Leonid Brezhnev, 1906 to 1982. With Khrushchev out of the way, technically Brezhnev was to lead the country along with Premier Alexei Kosygin, 1904 to 1981. But as head of the Communist Party, it was Brezhnev who truly held the power. By the early 1970s, Brezhnev emerged as the Soviet chief even though Kosygin remained in office until 1980. During his administration, Brezhnev kept tight control over the Eastern Bloc, communist countries, built up the Soviet Union's military, in what became an arms race with the United States, and did nothing to try to reverse the downward trend of the Soviet Union's economy. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, 1914 to 1984. However, Andropov died 2 years later and Konstantin Chernenko, 1911 to 1985, replaced him as premier. When Chernenko, too, died an untimely death in March 1985, Mikhail S. Gorbachev, 1931, became head of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union. With Gorbachev, the reign of the old guard of Stalin-trained leaders had come to an end. Gorbachev's policies of openness to the West and economic development led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. With communist rule ending in 1991 and each Soviet republic setting up its own government.
When was paper money first used?
Paper money first appeared in China during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. In the 9th century AD, paper notes were used by Chinese merchants as certificates of exchange and later, for paying taxes to the government. It was not until the 11th century, also in China, that the notes were backed by deposits of silver and gold, called hard money.
How was Cortés able to claim Mexico for the Spaniards?
On behalf of the European power, Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547, claimed Mexico after conquering its native peoples. In 1519 Cortés landed on the eastern coast of Mexico and founded the city of Veracruz. From there he marched inland, making an alliance with the Tlaxcalan Indians, who had fought wars against the powerful Aztecs in central Mexico. On November 8 of that year, Cortés marched into Mexico City. Then named Tenochtitlan, and took the Aztec leader, Montezuma, hostage. Cortés then continued to Mexico's west coast. When he returned to Mexico City in the central part of the country in 1520, he found the Aztecs in revolt against the Spaniards. Fierce fighting ensued, and by the end of June Montezuma was dead. This period of warfare is still remembered today by Mexicans as La Noche Triste, the sorrowful night. It was not until the following year, in August 1521, that Cortés, after a 4-month battle, claimed Mexico City, and the land came under control of the Spanish.
What was the Ottoman Empire?
It was a vast Turkish state founded in the 13th century by the Osmani Turks. Turks who were led by descendants of Osman I, 1258 c. 1326, by the middle of the next century, the Ottoman Empire consisted roughly of modern-day Turkey. The terms Turkey and Ottoman Empire are used interchangeably. The empire was expanded further by conquests during the 1400s, including the conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. At its height, the Byzantine Empire extended over an area that included the Balkan Peninsula, present-day Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece and Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, the northern coast of Africa, Palestine and parts of Arabia, Russia, and Hungary. The capital was placed at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey. Thus the Turks established a Muslim empire that would remain a formidable force and influence in the region and in Europe for the next 3 centuries. During the 1500s and 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful in the world. It reached its most glorious heights during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566. Who ruled from 1520 to 1566, it was he who added parts of Hungary to the Ottoman territory. He also tried to take Vienna, but failed. He did succeed in strengthening the Ottoman navy, which dominated the Mediterranean Sea. Suleiman was not only an expansionist, but a patron of the arts and a builder. He ordered the construction of mosques to spread the Islamic religion throughout the empire, bridges and other public works. But by the time World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline for some 300 years and only consisted of Asia Minor, parts of southwestern Asia, and part of the Balkan Peninsula. As one of the losing Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved in 1922 by the peace treaties that ended the war.
How did World War II begin?
The war began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. which was soon crushed by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler's 1889–1945 war machine. But while the Nazis moved in from the west, Poland was under attack by the Soviets from the north and east. The events in the Eastern European country had set the stage for a major conflict. After Poland, the Germans moved into Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and France, taking control as they went. By June 1940 only Great Britain stood against Hitler, who was joined by Axis power Italy. Before long, fighting had spread into Greece and northern Africa. In June 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union, enlarging the scope of the conflict again. With the world's focus on war-torn Europe, Japan executed a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941, which drew Americans into the war. The war would not end until 1945.